Hey Tom, nice to meet you.
Hi.
I'm very glad to talk with you today. I've been looking at your work ever since I started. Um, must be honest, like the Turing Machine through the Millard's Melodies video was one of the most important videos in my Eurorack career or my Eurorack experience. It truly like blew my mind, and ever since, like, your name stuck. And yeah, quite happy to have a conversation with you today.
Yeah, it's quite amazing when that happens, when you make something in your, in my shed that I'm in now, and you send it out into the world, and people like Myla or other people who just done a video for Microphony, which is a contact mic module, and Leaf Cutter John, who's a producer here in London, just gave one to him, and he made this incredible kind of 7-part video with just ideas that I would never have had. He had, at one point, he's got kind of elastic bands and pieces of wood stretched across his modular case, and it's kind of picking up the vibrations in that. So I just come up with a sort of simple electronic idea and send it out into the world. And it is amazing when those things get picked up and become something that you couldn't think of yourself. And I suppose the sort of thing you try and do as a designer is make things that are sort of open enough so that's possible, and complicated enough so that's possible, but not too complicated that people can't get into it and get started in it. So it's that sort of, I suppose that, yeah, that's the real sort of balance. Sometimes I'll think of something and I'll think, well, actually, I'm just like designing one patch, or I'm just freezing a patch into a module. And it's not really open enough. It's not really got a range of things that it can do. Other times you think I've got a real kind of, I don't know, this is a really interesting kind of building block, but you think, actually, I'm not sure anyone's going to have the patience to build up from that level of kind of abstraction. So it's kind of, because you could make Eurorack modules that were just like, op amps and inverters and resistors and capacitors, and you could make anything with that module, but that would probably be too much. So yeah, that's kind of the part of the balance that you're always trying to go through.
Yeah. I relate to that because I'm myself a digital product designer. I design apps and things like that, more on the user experience side. And there's always all those ideas that are attractive, that are interesting. We want to change the world and things like that. But at the end, there's a user.
Yeah.
And you have to put something in that user's hands. And like you said, can't be everything that you can come up with. It has to be a good balance of novelties and things they can recognize without like having something too complicated to interact with. Although you can also build something that's complicated. Some people like to jump into very complicated modules, for example. But from a design perspective, I think what's difficult to nail is exactly finding the right balance and reducing the amount of features and the amount of interaction to the point where it gets comfortable and like meaningful and fun and memorable and things like that. So yeah, for sure, I totally agree.
And that discipline of taking things out is really kind of pleasing, but kind of nerve-wracking, because and I think also there's that tension the other side, where when you see communities, you will say, I've made this thing, and somebody pops up and says, yeah, but can I do this? And you have to have the discipline to say, I mean, it could, yeah, if you want to make it, then you could make it with that and that and that, or you could make it smaller, or you could make it quadruple, or you could make it whatever those things are. And yeah, it's that how do you really kind of work out exactly what it is that somebody that's just simple enough, but not too simple, I suppose, is the thing you're going for.
Exactly, because if it's too simple, well, what do you have? Just a knob.
Yeah.
So if you extrapolate like that, yeah.
Oh, and the other thing is, it's always hard to tell what is going to get a response and what people get excited by. So, I mean, like, the best example for me was that contact mic thing, which it was first designed years ago, where it almost seemed like a joke from my point of view. It was just like, wouldn't it be funny if you could hear yourself patching and hear your fingers moving the knobs on the thing? And it was just like, it's not a thing that's a difficult thing to develop, and it's not a complicated idea. But after that went out into the world, people just come with all these different things you could do with it, that I absolutely hadn't imagined. And so that was, literally could not have been more simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in regards to the Eurorack community, you've been talking about like throwing yourself out there and interacting with the people in that community. What's Tom's mission in that community?
I don't know if I'd have a mission. I suppose. So I first started. I got into doing this sort of thing. I mean, I was in bands and stuff when I was at school, and I was interested in music, and then but I was never terribly good at it. Don't think I have much to contribute to the world in terms of making music. But in the sort of 2000s, I started a blog because my background's in journalism. So I started a blog about music gear, and it was sort of it was kind of celebrating that people enjoyed music gear almost as itself, as a thing in itself. And you didn't have to pretend that you were buying a fancy guitar because you wanted to get special tone, or you were an amazing sort of special guitarist, but because you wanted that guitar because you liked it. And I think it came around the time when computer music and sort of VSTs and digital audio had got to the stage where if you wanted to make music, you could do it on your computer and it would be great. You could recreate any synth, you could recreate any kind of studio setup or effects or whatever, more or less perfectly, and very, very cheaply. You could buy a cheap laptop and a bunch of stolen software and you could make anything. So at that point, I think the role of hardware and the role of physical things really changed. It changed from being fundamentally a tool that anyone making music has to have, and became a thing that was different from that. It was something that you might want to have. It's something that you might feel it could help you make music in different ways, and fundamentally it's something you kind of enjoy and you're interested in. And so I think that and I was always very kind of open and honest that we shouldn't be ashamed of that, and we shouldn't be pretending that it's something else that it isn't. And if people want to have a big argument whether analog or digital is better, that's fine, but it's not a terribly exciting argument.
Not anymore.
And so I kind of did that blog for a few years, and then that sort of led into then starting to make things. And it was, I suppose, when I first saw Eurorack, you could see that it was a very good platform for DIY because lots of the difficult things are already in place. So like if you want to make guitar pedals, you have to have 6 sides of an enclosure, a top and a back and 4 sides. And you're quite limited to power. You just have this kind of 9-volt power, which is quite annoying for some electronic things. Whereas if you want to make anything more complicated than guitar pedal, you've got enclosures and complicated power and that kind of stuff. The thing with Eurorack was you only need one side because the rest of it's covered in the box. You've got this very useful sort of 12-volt power that is good and easy for electronics. And it's a kind of cheap platform that you can make things very, very easily, and you can make them for yourself. And then at that time, the community was developing, and also the ability to produce things in small quantities was developing. So you could go to China and get circuit boards made. You could go to a laser cutter and get front panels made. You could go to Mazda in Texas and they send you all the parts very cheaply. and open source was becoming a much more
Mm-hmm.
established, understood thing. So you could publish things, and people could share them, and they could understand the point of it. So all those things kind of combined, and I sort of thought, well, I've got an idea for a thing, and so the first real thing I designed was that Turing Machine sequencer, and I can kind of publish this out into the world. And it was very like blogging, but with hardware.
Mm-hmm.
What happened very quickly at that point was then Steve Grimley Taylor, who now runs Thonk, I saw that on a forum and said, oh, why don't I do a group buy for this? So I kind of published these designs, and he said, rather than you having to go to the laser cutter and go to the Chinese PCB people and go to Mauser in Texas for your parts, I'll do this and I'll send out a kit to people. And I was like, great, that's even easier, that's better. And that activity of Steve's basically became Thonk, which is a kind of, if what I was doing was kind of hardware blogging, he was kind of a hardware record label. So he now acts as my kind of manager and kind of label boss. So I will kind of say to him, oh, Steve, I've got this idea for there's this thing I've invented like this. And he'll say, oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, we should make some of them. We'll make 250 of them. And I'll say, really? That seems like a lot. I mean, it's quite a weird thing. But he's the boss. He decides how that works. And so he does all of the kind of manufacturing, the distribution. We sort of share the customer support. And that, for me, has worked very well. So I suppose that enables me to try to make things that I want to have myself. I mean, that's the basic sort of principle of it, as with any of these kind of things, is to be as sort of self-indulgent as I can be and think, what would I like that I can't buy anywhere else? And then, if of all the things I kind of make, it's one that feels a bit more interesting, then I'll say to him, do you fancy making these? And generally he seems to want to make them. And then they kind of go out into the world.
That's quite interesting. And there's a question that I would like to ask is, I hear makers, and specifically makers, saying, it's difficult to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of creative modules out there. There's a lot of independent module makers that are doing new things. It's always hard to bring something fresh to the market. But at the same time, I hear an opposite thing from makers, and you just said it. This is the thing I have in mind doesn't exist right now in the world. So I hear both, and to me, it's like it's interesting, because on one side you're like, it's hard to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time I hear, what, this thing doesn't exist. And what do you think about this interesting duality?
I mean, I suppose, well, one thing is, when you design something, you get so deep into it
Like this.
that it feels to you like it's different. I'm sure there's a strong element of that. So it's like if you're making music, if you're a techno producer, and if I don't know anything at all about techno, it's going to be like a 909 with some bleeps on top of it and a 4/4 kick drum. And it sounds like the same as all the other ones. But if I'm a techno producer or somebody who understands that, then it will be very different. And there'll be a big difference between what I've made and the one that someone else has made. And if you're a DJ and you're playing that, you'll go, that's a terrible one, that's a good one. So there's a kind of an element of that, I think, where people are designing. I mean, somebody designs a new type of, malt that somehow connects signals together in a slightly different way from anyone else's, I guess.
Yeah.
I think so. An element of that, I think, that they are the same thing. Everyone is trying to make something distinctive, and they are just, some are more distinctive than others, perhaps. But I think, for me, fundamentally, if I can just go and buy it, why wouldn't I just go and buy it? you know, and it. I suppose I've had very explicit that I remember years and years and years ago, I was going to go and buy a for spring reverb. They're the only people who made a spring reverb. And for some reason, I think kind of interest or whatever, I thought, well, actually, I could probably make myself one. You know, I can make and I ended up making one that was sort of smaller and cheaper, sort of, and possibly better sounding than the Doppler one. And so that was the process. And as I developed that, there were things that I put into that other people didn't have. So I had, the sort of version 2 of that has a feedback control in it, has a kind of phase inversion control in it, because I like feedback, and it's kind of that's the thing that makes it interesting. So it's seeing something and then saying, what can I add that makes it distinctive? But I think it is really difficult, and I think it's difficult for customers, it's difficult as a kind of market. But I always compare it as well with the kind of guitar pedal market, because it's an interesting comparison. And I think the thing with the guitar pedals is they're a lot simpler and there are a lot fewer variations. You know, at least in Eurorack, there's fundamental things like, oscillators and filters and envelopes and those sorts of things. In guitar pedals, there's distortion, delay, kind of chorusy things, I guess, and that's basically pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
And that's been going on for what, 40 years, 50 years, and people still invent new kinds of distortion every year. I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think there's a kind of, I think everyone is trying to do something distinctive. But it is difficult, and I think finding the inspiration for that is a big part of what we're all trying to do. I think, and I suppose there's a point at the start of a scene, but this would have now been like 20 years ago, where you'd be like, well, I haven't got this type of filter, or I haven't got this type of oscillator, and maybe I can make one of those. But on the other side, you do constantly see new things being developed. I was visiting a big module design in the UK yesterday, and he had 3 or 4 things in there that I'd just never seen before that he's developing that he hasn't released yet. And you just think there's something really smart in each of those things.
Mm-hmm. So do you think like the distinctions we have between all the new modules are significant, or we're in a period of time where all the new modules more or less have distinctions under the hood, like tiny things that an engineer can see, but maybe not as easily, maybe it's not as easy for the common users to see. I see a lot of new modules being trying to throw something out there that's really different, and you can feel the difference. But I also see a lot of modules and makers saying, hey, this is new, I do things differently, but it's really under the hood, and like you said, you're really close to what you're creating and you see all those differences. But in the end, how significant it is, you think, for the end users?
I think it's really hard to tell, because it's really hard to see to get in the mind of an end user. I mean, you definitely see that sense of, if there are hundreds of makers and some of them are trying to do everything. So I've never you can't really have a full music thing modular rig. I mean, I've sort of done it a bit, but it becomes quite a weird setup. And I don't think I've never done like a filter or an oscillator, or so it becomes quite an odd setup if you try and do it just with my stuff. But you get quite a lot of people seem like they will be like, I'm going to make one of everything. So I'm going to make an analog oscillator, I'm going to make maybe a digital oscillator. I'm going to make a couple of filters, and an envelope generator, and a mixer, and I mean, for me personally, that just feels kind of exhausting, and I can't really see what they're doing with that. But that dream of a kind of complete system, again, the person I was talking to yesterday had a few things where he was saying, well, I've done that because we don't have one of those, and I thought it would be good to make one. It kind of ticks a box, and it means they can sell complete systems and that sort of thing. So I don't know. That's a very hedging the answer, because I think it's certainly something I hear from kind of retailers is that the volume of releases, the volume of new things is very difficult to kind of maintain and keep up with, and that as a kind of industry, it's quite difficult to cut through.
I'm really curious about like what's next for you and the music thing, Modular. What's next? What's your latest achievement? Where are you going? Where are you?
So, so the kind of things that I've done recently have almost been at the kind of two ends. So I released this little, trying to see where one is, this little fader MIDI thing for this chap,
I've seen that.
Which is by far the sort of longest and most arduous and most time-consuming thing that I've designed. Not for particularly good reasons, but it took a really long time during the period where there was problems with like parts shortages and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it was also learning a whole lot of new things along the way. So it was learning about this connects to a browser, so you can configure it. So there was a lot of kind of programming onto the digital side in it, but also it's very small and thin and quite different from what we would do in Eurorack world. And it was interesting doing that. I mean, again, it's interesting seeing the reactions that people have. Finley Shakespeare is a musician in the UK. He has one connected to his Nord modular, and because it's also an accelerometer, so you can move it and shake it. He's got it based on a guitar patch, so as you move it, it's like it strums a guitar, and then the faders control the kind of feedback and the tone of the thing. So that's, again, complicated thing. There's obviously some skills that I've got from that I can see might be useful for other things. But then just after that, released a new version of that microphony contact mic thing, which is ears. So I designed the original one. Then Emily from Musical Instruments said, I want to do a version of this because it works really well with kind of rings and things. So she took my design, made it much better, added a load of other features, just did it properly because she knows what she's doing. Now that Mutable has kind of retired, I then kind of took it back and said, okay, I don't really agree with some of your design decisions on this. So I'm just kind of physically reshaping it a bit. And that's so you've got the kind of range from these kind of very complicated, sophisticated digital things to really very simple analog devices. And I think the ideas of the things I'm looking at the moment, really it's that whole range. So there's an event I'm doing next year where I've been asked to host a kind of a retreat for musicians. So a bunch of musicians will go to a big house in Cornwall in the south west of England, and we'll spend a week sort of working together and working with graphic scores. We have graphic scores, and sort of composing with them, sort of bringing those scores to life. And so I'm sort of thinking about whether there are any devices that would be useful for that event. That's quite an interesting kind of prompt to say, what would it be like to build something that people can use in a specific kind of context? I'm not sure I'm actually going to get them done in time for the event, so we'll see. The other thing I've been doing a lot of is reading a book, which is somewhere up there. Maybe it's on the other shelf. This book, which is a very big book, as you can see. So this is about David Tudor, and he was this 1960s, 70s. He was started as a pianist in the 1950s, and was really a kind of pioneer of live electronic music. And this book is just like, I literally opened a random page. It's like, goes through all of these crazy, he kind of invented the noise table. So there are all these pictures of him with just mountains of weird homemade electronics. And a lot of them are very simple. That's one of my favorite ones, which is some kind of crazy sort of plotter device.
Yeah.
Some of them are really simple. They do things like they will have inputs that can also be outputs, which suddenly makes you think, well, what on earth is that? Or how do you make a device like that?
Yeah.
So that's kind of really, really inspiring, really interesting. And it's quite, one of the things I've been doing that is you're kind of reading it and then it describes a device. And often these devices are like 7 or 8 components in it. And then I'll come out to here and kind of cobble together something with those components that will work on kind of Eurorack, and you put it in the rack and go, oh, it's not really terribly interesting. You need kind of 20 of them to do something interesting in a row. But that kind of way into looking at these kind of very primitive, very early, but very kind of expressive and weird, very analog electronics. There's kind of a difference between that world and that world, the kind of two ends of what I'm looking at the moment.
Right. What you just showed me, like your device, is it Eurorack compatible or?
No, this one's completely. It's basically MIDI. I mean, it has a hardware MIDI out there, but it's really nothing to do with Eurorack. It's kind of. It was described. Somebody I know, an online person I know, was saying what I want is a really small MIDI controller that I can use in the library. And he described the idea of you go to the library to do some work and then you take a little break and you fire up Ableton and you sit there doing this. And I did that in the British Library the other day. I was in the British Library doing some research, and I got bored and sat there making weird noises with headphones on. It's
funny. It's funny because you took it as a game console controller, basically sitting and
it's exactly
playing.
It's got little buttons on the back, which are like little fire buttons. They can fire notes or CC signals through. And because it moves,
oh really?
You can so it's an accelerometer as well. So you can set it and then set different.
Wow.
It's essentially like that's a gesture, that's one, that's one. I think turning the whole thing over
and everything between, right?
And so you can then start mapping that. I mean, that's another whole interesting world, is how you map them, and or you can just set like triggers, so you can kind of shake it, that sort of thing. But yeah, that's not, and it's been interesting as well that there are people who maybe read my blog a few years ago, or read some of the stuff I write, but don't have Eurorack. So it's a kind of way in to do something slightly different. And I think that's another thing I'm kind of interested in, is working out how do you do things that are radically cheaper or radically more accessible than some of the Eurorack stuff we do. Although the other end, the other side of that sort of market, when you talk to people in the industry, they say one of the things that is remarkable is that you can sell things for £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, and they go. You talk to a big retailer and they're like, you get in 10 or 15 of these things, and they shift. They go. And I was talking to a designer when I was in Berlin recently, who was saying he's seeing the things he's made that are at that end of the market that are really kind of big and sort of impressive and one-off, sometimes it's easier to sell those than it is to sell something that's £200, £300, £400. So that I found really interesting. I've never done anything in that sort of world, and I think that's a really interesting notion. I think looking at those two ends is really interesting. What can you do if you remove the limitation of something that is affordable?
Yeah.
Might let you make something interesting and learn something. I mean, one of my favorite designers is Meng Shi, the Chinese designer, and he works very much at those both ends. So he did what's it called? This thing hidden in there. So that is the Wingy, which is a kind of little standalone, completely digital thing that has two microphones in it, a couple of controls, and then two manuals of like black and white keys here. And that's like a relatively affordable thing. I think it was I thought it was a couple of €100, I think. But also he does these beautiful big kind of he does a thing called the Wing Pinger, which is this great big kind of keyboard with various kind of oscillators and a very, very distinctive kind of sound and effect. And that's like £1,500 or £2,000 or something. And I think that sort of discipline of looking at the two ends. I mean, Teenage Engineering, I think, is a perfect example of this. They will make the most expensive thing imaginable, and they will make the pocket operators, which are the cheapest thing imaginable. And I think that discipline of looking at both ends is a really good way to look at things. I just haven't. I mean, I do think they're expensive because they're modular, but I've never done anything where the individual object is substantially big and expensive.
That's interesting that because what you're basically saying is you're designing for two different markets, the high-end market and the more affordable market. And with my designer's mind, I'm like, how do you shift your designer's mind from designing something that's for a different market to designing something that just necessitates so much different types of attentions? Like, you can't drop the ball on quality. It has to be much more sturdy, and so on. Like, the quality needs to be there. And for me, it's challenging to shift in such a paradigm. And it's interesting to me that you're basically saying, you know what, it's a good way of approaching maybe my markets or how my brand develops or something like that. It's interesting to me. It's kind of like different, but you seem to be quite comfortable in all the, maybe not the full spectrum, but at the edges of that spectrum.
I mean, I'm really interested in it, and I think one of the other really interesting things I think with Eurorack is where the cost is. So it's not at all obvious where the cost is. So like that chip that I'm playing with there costs 50p for one, so next to nothing for more.
Yeah.
And is a Chinese kind of codec, so it takes stereo input and stereo output, and you connect it to a controller, and it will make, it will sound nice. It's the basic system that is in every sort of digital module, and that's incredibly powerful. And that, you can get a slightly better one, that'll cost a few pounds more, but fundamentally it's a very important, critical thing that is fundamentally pretty cheap. Whereas on a module like that knob costs about £1, £1.50 or something. That potentiometer behind it, which is the kind of standard, normal, good quality ones that I always use, costs, I think, about £1.50.
Mm-hmm.
But adding one knob costs £2 or £3 cost. Less if you're making it at a bigger scale, but it's it's a significant cost. So you could add 6 channels of stereo in and out for the price of one pot, and that's why something like that is engineered. It's engineered exactly the way it is, because the micro switches are very cheap.
Yeah.
Switches there are very cheap. Microphones are very cheap, but a whole bunch of faders and knobs and sliders would be expensive. So you can't do that. So that's where actually something that's big and has got a lot of knobs on it becomes expensive. So
Yeah.
that sort of balance between what's expensive and what's cheap, I think, is a really interesting kind of challenge. And yeah, again, talking to somebody the other day about, they were like, I want to do something cheap. And you say, well, you're going to need to put those little kind of trimmer pots on it, because they cost about 80p. So one, even not big ones, even one of those kind of simple like Davies knobs with a pot underneath is about £1.50. Whereas a trimmer will be about 80p. And when you have to double that and triple that and whatever to get it to retail prices, it really kind of changes the way you think about an interface. And it's a kind of, and that's where the limitations come. That's when, if you say, I want to make something really cheap, you're really having to design an interface that works in that context. Whereas if you make something big, you might have quite a different thing you can do.
Right. So you negotiate much more on the cost of things with modular, with the Eurorack modules, for example, because you want to keep them affordable. And on the other end of the spectrum, you're basically saying, like, you know what? We can do what we want. We don't have to negotiate as much. But at the same time, I can easily see like a synthesizer, a full synthesizer costing
still,
10,000 US dollars, because you know what? You didn't negotiate on anything. But then you're like,
you always have to consider it. But then the other thing you can do, hang on, I'll just grab something else. So that module there,
yeah,
was basically, the idea of this was, can you make an expensive experience? And it is funny, when you give somebody one of these, they just start doing this, because this has kind of fancy, you can see there's a bigger knobs, bigger potentiometers underneath. And it's like, can we create something where the luxury is here, but you have that, and it makes all of your other modules around it more luxurious because you can connect them up to this. So there's kind of different ways of trying to work out where you're spending the money, because you could then get a bunch of those really kind of super condensed modules with little tiny trimmer things, plug them into that, and create quite a nice, interesting experience.
so basically you decide to spend more resources on the core feature.
Yeah, well, you have to decide. I mean, that's where you have to decide what you're going to spend. So for me, I think I'm always fundamentally building the interface, because if you're building the sound, you can do that on a computer. It's fine.
Right. And it's probably
I'm making an interface.
Yeah. And it's probably one of the reasons why you absolutely need to get to a simple version of what you want to put out there. Like you basically showed like how is it called again? This module is the control.
That one's just called control. Yeah.
Yeah. So the control, like, to me, it's very interesting, because the focus is on, of course, controlling, and it's not that you left everything else aside. It's just that the rest might be more onto the standards.
This is for somebody else to worry about. Yeah, I mean, there is nothing in this. It doesn't make sounds, doesn't filter anything. It just puts out a bunch of voltages at the top. I mean, these are basically the same thing. And the idea, I really like this, and all the systems I have that in it, because the two things it does: one is it kind of opens up other modules as well, but also it means you forget what it's plugged into, and you just start turning the controls and seeing what happens. So you're listening rather than looking in a conscious way. So you just catch a bunch of wires up to other places and then see what comes out of it.
Right. It's some sort of a macro controller.
Yeah. But I think because it's analog as the way you're connecting up, it's much more instinctive and random, I think, than like setting up a bunch of macros in Ableton where you're like, okay, this is my cutoff point and this is my, where you're very deliberate about it. With this, I mean, obviously you can do it in a very deliberate way, but I think you're much more likely to be, certainly for me, you maybe forget what it's been patched into, and it seems to shift the whole patch. And also the little switch at the top change the range, so you might have it so it does something sensible in a kind of 0 to 5 range, then you flip it into -5 to +5, and suddenly it's much more kind of far out than it was, or it shifts the oscillators out of audible range, those sorts of things. So you get a much bigger change with a smaller movement, I suppose.
Yeah, and I believe that it's the beautiful thing behind Eurorack modules or Eurorack world, but also what you've been doing, where there's a good compromise between chaos and order, where as a musician, you also get surprised by your system. And I think we should not lose that kind of thing. And I think you've been doing great things on that side. Very interesting, and the control is just another example. I see you showing, and maybe this is the last question I want to ask you. I see you like bringing this new thing in front of the camera. You've been doing that across, you've been doing that across the conversation, and I'm just wondering, is that
that's literally something I was doing this morning. I had an idea for something that has a brain, so that's the cheap Raspberry Pi RP2040. I mean, that's the thing, which is a chip that is available, quite powerful, quite nice to program, and they cost 40p. So this together is like less than £1 worth of actual kind of chips. And I'm just at the very early stage of thinking, well, what could you do if those work? Is there something in a kind of lo-fi? I don't know. This is literally I mean, basically, to control this chip, you need a simple connection, which is a kind of what's called I2C, which is basically how you control it and tell it what to do. And then you've got a sort of fast connection that's kind of pumping audio into it. It's called I2S. This is literally this morning. I was like, can I get it to talk to the I2C? And it seems like I've successfully soldered it onto the adapter there. And it seems like it's saying hello over I2C, but that's a very, very long way from doing anything useful, or even working out what would a useful thing for it to be. Because with chips like that, they're kind of quite low-end chips. So it's not going to be like a super powerful like DSP effect. But it might be there are interesting things you could do something like that with delays, and I don't know. We'll see.
Right, and will that be Eurorack friendly?
Probably. Yeah, I don't have an idea. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly very much still making Eurorack things, so it's pretty early stage for that. But the idea I have for that would definitely be a Eurorack friendly.
That's awesome. Well, I guess this is a good place to stop, letting this open-ended and allowing us to dream about what this thing will be or could be. So thanks very much, Tom, and I guess we can do that some other time.